From the cliffside dwellings of Colorado to Seattle's Space Needle to Chicago's skyscrapers and the Victorian row houses of San Francisco, as the United States has expanded and grown increasingly diverse, so has its architecture. In this lesson, we'll examine some examples of American architectural landmarks in order to answer our lesson essential question: what factors influenced the development of architecture in the United States? To help us get there, we'll use these guiding questions. How did colonialism affect the development of the architecture of the French Quarter and the California missions? And how did economics influence architecture in the United States? To answer these guiding questions, you will annotate or take notes on the images in your lesson PDF. As you watch the video, this pencil icon and this sound will be your cue to get ready to take notes. Alternatively, you can pause at the end of each section to complete the annotations if you prefer. As always, feel free to pause or rewind the video as needed. Our first destination is Bourbon Street in the French Quarter of New Orleans, NOLA to the locals. For this section, you will identify how the French and Spanish influenced architecture in the French Quarter by annotating the images in your PDF. Initially founded by the French in 1718, New Orleans was laid out in a grid pattern with streets named after French royalty and nobility like the Bourbons. Then, less than 50 years later, in 1762, Spain gained control of Louisiana. Under Spanish rule, two devastating fires destroyed much of the wooden buildings the French had constructed. The Spanish rebuilt the city using fire-resistant materials, but the original French influence remained, using a blend of Spanish and French architectural styles. Let's look at an example. Originally created under French rule, these multi-story buildings had main living quarters located on the upper floors, an adaptation to the frequent flooding of the nearby Mississippi River. But the thick brick walls, arches supported by piers, and wrought iron balconies were all features of Spanish colonial architecture. Today, the French Quarter has retained its French and Spanish character, which has helped make it one of the nation's most recognizable neighborhoods. If necessary, pause here to complete the annotations for the French Quarter before we move on. Spanish colonialism also affected the development of architecture in California through the creation of the California mission system. For this section, you will identify the Spanish and indigenous influences on the California missions by annotating the images in your PDF. The California mission system consists of 21 missions, or small religious communities, built in California between 1769 and 1823 by Spanish Franciscan missionaries to convert the native population to Christianity while expanding the Spanish Empire. The mission's overall architectural style reflects Spanish colonial design. The missions were typically single-story buildings constructed around a central courtyard. A chapel was located on one end, some of which are still in use, mirroring the traditional design of Spanish monasteries and forts. Local indigenous peoples, who were used as forced laborers for the mission's construction, adapted Spanish techniques by using locally available materials like adobe, wood, stone, and tile. Surrounding the mission buildings were fields, gardens, and grazing lands, necessary for the mission to be largely self-sufficient, though they were dependent on the forced labor of indigenous peoples. The layout of the missions was practical and adapted to California's Mediterranean climate. Porticos, or long open corridors, offered shade and a cool place during the hot summers. Thick adobe walls provided insulation against both heat and cold. If necessary, pause here to complete the annotations for the California missions before we move on. Economic trends like industrialization also influenced architecture. For this section, you will identify how industrialization impacted the design and construction of the Lowell Mills. The Lowell Mills were textile manufacturing mills founded in the 1820s in Lowell, Massachusetts. They symbolized the transition of the United States from a largely agrarian society to an industrialized nation. During the industrial era in the United States, the Lowell Mills pioneered the Lowell system, which is a type of vertical integration. Vertical integration is a system where all the means of production are controlled by a single group or company. As you previously learned, the means of production are the processes and steps needed to produce a good. In this case, this included everything from the weaving of fabrics to the workers themselves. The Lowell system achieved vertical integration by building centralized complexes that housed all components of textile production in one place, from the looms to workers' housing. This design was intended to increase efficiency and profits. These workers included the Lowell Mill Girls, which was the nickname given to the primarily young, unmarried women employed by the Lowell Mills. Their living quarters consisted of simple boarding houses. For some women and girls, the ability to live and work away from their families was seen as liberating. However, in order to live in the company-owned housing, they had to follow strict rules. Pause here to examine some of those rules in your PDF and respond to the reflection question. Over time, this style of centralized industrial planning became known as a factory village or mill town, a type of planned settlement that developed around mills, factories, or other industrial centers. As industrialization became more widespread, so did factory villages. If necessary, pause here to complete the annotations for the Lowell Mills before we move on. But industrialization wasn't the only economic trend that influenced architecture in the United States. For this section, you will focus on how consumer culture shaped and was shaped by the development of department stores. Consumer culture, or a culture where social status, values, and activities are based on the purchase and use of goods and services, also influenced architectural trends. In the early 20th century, the growing popularity of department stores like the Marshall Field Building in Chicago reflected transition to a consumer-oriented society, the growth of the middle class, and a growing demand for convenience. Like the Lowell system, which centralized the components of manufacturing, department stores sought to centralize the consumption and purchase of goods within a single building. The expansion of electricity and new technologies like elevators and escalators allowed these department stores to expand higher and higher while allowing customers to move about from floor to floor and department to department with ease. But department stores were not just designed to be places to purchase goods. They also became destinations, offering amenities like restaurants and the Marshall Field Tea Room. Consequently, department stores were not just places to shop, but also places to see and be seen. If necessary, pause here to complete your annotations for this section. Sometimes architecture defies economic trends. For this section, you will identify the significance of the construction of the Empire State Building during the Great Depression. The Empire State Building was constructed in the midst of the Great Depression, one of the most severe economic downturns in U.S. history. Some thought the investors were foolish to tackle such a project during such an economically tumultuous period. However, for others, it symbolized the massive industrial potential of the American economy. The project employed thousands during a time of high unemployment, giving a much-needed boost to struggling families. However, workplace injuries and the deaths of 5 construction workers raised issues around workers' rights and safety. The construction of the Empire State Building showcased the rapid advancements in technology and engineering at the time. It demonstrated the potential of a new material, steel, which enabled the creation of towering skyscrapers. The Empire State Building became a cultural icon and symbol of modernity. Its Art Deco design, an artistic movement characterized by its use of geometric shapes and patterns, smooth lines, and intricate details, reflected the prevailing architectural style of the time, embracing a growing enthusiasm for change and progress as well as hope for the future. If necessary, pause here to complete the annotations for the Empire State Building. American architecture has always been influenced by broad trends and changes in society and the economy, but it has also been influenced by innovation, individualism, and personal wealth. In the lesson PDF, you'll have a chance to explore how individuals used their wealth to create massive, luxurious private residences that reflected their position amongst America's wealthy elite. Until next time, keep making history.